pelvis. So we're going to talk about the pelvis, and we're going to talk about the pelvis for like a principles-based approach. It means we're going to talk about principles and basically see how these principles apply to the pelvis, right? There's some like governing, overarching rules of movement that will allow us to solve more complex problems faster as we understand these principles and how they cross apply across the human body, right? So this is not going to be a webinar where we give you all the answers. It's hopefully by the end of it a webinar where we teach you how to ask better questions, right? So it's, we talk about lower body and we talk about muscle mass, we talk about injury rehabilitation. These principles fly above all of those concepts in resistance training, rehab, and so on and so forth. So it's not going to be necessarily like, this is how we do a quad extension, or this is how we do a hamstring curl. We're going to talk about the pelvis from this principles-centric viewpoint. And what we're going to highlight is going to be three major things that we go over as I pull up the slides here. We're going to talk about center of mass, how it affects the position of the pelvis. We're going to talk about the importance of the position of the pelvis. We're going to talk about the structure function relationships at the pelvis. That's actually where we'll kick things off, is on the structure function relationship. So understanding kind of a continuum of like, well, first off, like, what is the pelvis? Like, what is the pelvis comprised of? And we're going to zoom out and look at it at a resolution that's operable, and not like operable, like with a scalpel. I mean, operable as far as our day-to-day lives, as far as it concerns to resistance training, rehabilitation, and things of the like. So let me get the slides up. I finally found them. You think I'd be better at this by now? And pelvis webinar. Did we do it? And share. Brilliant. Okay, so we should be well on our way here. So what are we going to go over? Okay, so we are going to go over the principles of structure function. This is really important when it comes to the human body in general, right? So what does it mean when I talk about structure function? Well, structure function is going to be sort of this sliding scale of different tissues, right? So if we take a look here, and let me blow this up to full slideshow mode. Great. So when we talk about structure function relationships, what we're talking about is we're going to be talking about the sliding scales of tissues from active to passive in the human body. This is so important at the pelvis because we kind of inherently understand principles of structure function relationships at other parts of the body. We just don't really give the pelvis its day in the sun. So what do I mean? So has anyone let's see, I'm going to go in the chat box. Has anyone here ever yes, it is going to be recorded for later viewing. So if you'll get an email tomorrow morning with the link of the recording, has anyone here rolled an ankle before? Right. So has anyone ever basketball or stepped off a curb? Maybe you're clumsy, maybe you're rocking the heels, or maybe you live where we live, Toronto, Hamilton, Alberta, New York, and it's freezing cold. And your landlord, he doesn't put the salt down and you just eat shit in the morning. And guess what? You're just going to keep rolling that ankle time and time again. Why? Because like we kind of inherently know that the ankle is really more to like this end of the structure function relationship, right? So if we take a look at this slideshow here and we see like, okay, on the far left of this, we see bone, right? So bone is very passive, right? Bone is very inert from a movement standpoint, right? Like long bones can help us generate red blood cells, and like bone is useful, don't get me wrong, but from a movement perspective, bone just does the bidding, right? It's the stuff that's just moving around. So as we move from the far left end of the spectrum, structure, bone, ligaments. So ligaments, ligaments have an ability to change length and not necessarily contract like a muscle, obviously, but it has an ability to retake shape. If anyone's gone into the physical therapy world, it's a principle called hysteresis. So hysteresis curves, like, well, how long does it take for a ligament to get back to its normal length? And how long does it take a tendon to get back to its normal length? So we have bone, ligament, fascia. Fascia is a tricky one. We're going to put it here for now, but you can contest fascia's position across this structure function hierarchy or continuum. Tendon, now we're getting into the good stuff. Right? Tendons do the bidding of muscles, and muscles are hardwired by the nervous system. So the holy grail of function is going to be the nervous system, right? So it's going to be the brain. So the central nervous system, as we taxonomize that, what does central nervous system mean? Central means the brain and spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system is all the other nerve stuff outside of the brain and spinal cord, right? So, the muscle is a conduit of both sensory input and motor output that we would say it belongs within the realm of the peripheral nervous system, right? So altogether, that makes the nervous system, and the nervous system is sort of like our governor. It's our computer in our head, and when we look to organize movements, especially when it comes to like improving movements, we should probably focus on the stuff that we can control, right? And none of us here are orthopedic surgeons, and if you are, maybe you're not a good one. If your job doesn't involve knives and staples and sutures and pins and rods and things like that, and it involves reps and sets and exercises and gym floors or rehab centers and all that stuff, then we're probably going to pay attention to the things that we can impact and influence, which are going to be nervous system, muscle, tendon. And then we can infer their impact downstream on structure, right? Into fascia, ligament, and bone. So the goal here is, we talked about the ankle. We had a few people sort of raise their metaphorical hand in the chat box. And we said, all right, who's rolled an ankle? We had a hand of people agree. I did mine. I rolled my right ankle at a rookie party. I played hockey for our Canadian friends here. So I went to a rookie party when I played junior C hockey. And as you know, this is when bullying was like, oh man, this was when bullying was like, yo, we got to stop this. This is nuts. And I'll tell you why it was nuts, because I was doing keg stands in a diaper, but also in a dunk contest. Shout out hazing, shout out bullying. So you had to do the dunk contest off a trampoline after you did a keg stand, and I landed on my right ankle and I just blew it up. Dude, rookie party hazing is nuts. And that was like a relatively tame one. Like we liked each other. But blew up my right ankle. And you know what? My right ankle has been giving me an issue ever since, Doc. I was like 17 years old. I'm 33. So why does my ankle give me issues? It's like, well, the majority of the integrity of my ankle is more on the structure side, right? Like it's like bone and ligament. Like I can't sit here and go, I'm going to contract my anterior talofibular, right? Like anterior talofibular ligament, most commonly a sprained ligament in the ankle complex. It's just two strings that go between bones, right? Like I can't really do much about it. Whereas, like, for example, I've dislocated my shoulder. I don't know if anyone else has dislocated their shoulder. Feel free to raise your hand or go in the thing. So I've dislocated both my shoulders once. Now, my shoulder has much more function, way more muscles, like a lot of muscles, right? So I have like the muscles in my rotator cuff. I also have muscles that act on my shoulder blade, right? So we can go like, well, the three fibers of the trap or the serratus or the rhomboid or the levator or then we're going up to the supraspinatus or the teres minor, the teres major. Then we got like the big rocks, right? So we got fractured shoulder. That sounds like a good story. Hopefully it wasn't a rookie party. Then we got big rocks like deltoid, bicep, tricep, subscap, so on and so forth, right? So these are muscles that kind of go from the arm to the scap to the arm, or the scap to the rib cage and spine, or spine towards the scapula, right? So there's so much potential to outfunction damaged structure. I would rather take a fractured shoulder, not to be unsympathetic to your plight, my friend, than a fractured calcaneus, right? Like a heel bone, because there's a lot less of the stuff I can control. Now, here's the thing as it pertains to our conversation today about the pelvis. The pelvis, as we look at it so often, gets sort of just painted with this brush of just being like structure first. If I said pelvis, or when I've been saying pelvis this whole time, this is likely the image you had in your head, right? So we're going to identify the structure, function, and we're going to talk about the relationships between the two so that we can help you make better decisions faster when it comes to your training, be able to triage and troubleshoot movement on the fly based off of a few core principles of movement that really govern the entire body, but we're going to see how they govern the pelvis specifically. So what are we looking at here, right? We're looking at, we got, if you guys are familiar with the anatomy, we have like a femur head, right? The femur head sits in the acetabulum. The acetabulum is part of, broadly the ilium, what we call the ilium, right? So the ilium is like a wing. It actually, ilia is Latin for wing. Pro tip, if you own a gym or a business, works for coffee shops, works a trick at coffee shops, and you want to bring people to your business, just paint wings on the brick outside of your thing and just watch teenage girls and people on the internet just line up for days to be the sacrum. And you'll have a little pelvis thing, and you'll sit there and you'll laugh and you'll chuckle and you'll be like, that's a pelvis. And they'll just take a picture, like, little laugh, love. and it's just wings outside, right? But so ilia houses the acetabulum. Acetabulum is the socket of the ball and socket joint. The socket articulates with the femur head. And off the femur head, as we travel down, we have a femur neck, right? It kind of moves it out towards the bulk of the femur, which we kind of see on the lateral side. So on the outside, we're going to see what we call the greater trochanter. And then on the insides, that little like nub sitting off the inside there, that's going to be the lesser trochanter, right? Now, look, pelvis comes in all shapes and sizes, right? And understanding structural variability is very important, but only in the context of understanding the underwriting function, right? A lot of people will just chalk up their inability to perform a movement, squat, for example, like, oh, I have really deep hip sockets. It's like, do you? Have you tried trying? So we're going to see like, all right, well, what are the things we can really try to outfunction bad structure, air quote, bad structure, whether that bad structure is something injury related, whether that bad structure is just morphological, right? Like, you got Celtic parents or something like that. And, so there's a research study that's out years ago about looking at cadavers from different parts of the world. And what they saw is that people in some regions have deeper hip sockets that makes it a little bit harder to get, passive range of motion through this joint, the femoral acetabular joint or the hip joint, without being obstructed, and in other parts of the world where they see the cadavers display the technical word would be anthropometry, display a makeup that would be a little bit more favorable to moving, right? So just watch Olympic weightlifting and you'll pretty much get your answer at the Olympics, right? There's not a whole lot of guys that look like your boy here at the podium at the Olympics for Olympic weightlifting. Now there's a lot to it. Drugs, let's be honest, the right ones. So that's a big thing. This is not going to be a thing about drugs. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. So we got our landmarks here. Sacrum. So sacrum is a wedged triangle of vertebra. Essentially, that's what it is, right? So the sacrum is going to be a continuation of sorts of the lumbar spine. But now this is tricky as we get into sacrum, ilium, and we'll talk about the femoral acetabular joint, initial tuberosity in a second. As we talk about the sacrum and ilium specifically, that makes up the SI joint, right? So the sacroiliac joint. So where the sacrum articulates with the ilium. And this is going to be important. And we're going to revisit this as we move into the next component of the presentation. We're going to talk about the SI joint, and we need to have quite literally a three-dimensional understanding of how this works. Okay. So the SI joint oftentimes will get broken down very two-dimensionally. Okay. So we have like a sacrum. So our tailbone type, well, not necessarily our tailbone per se, but what most people might refer to as their tailbone, this wedge between these two wings. And then as we look between these two wings, right, this wedge, its articulating surface with the wing has what we call an instantaneous axis of rotation, right? So instantaneous axis of rotation means that this joint between the sacrum and the ilium, although it does not move much, but it does move, and its movement's important given its location. It's like a force transfer superhighway in the body, right? It's taking ground forces and putting it up into the spine, right? It's taking applied forces and putting it down into the hips, and it's going from left to right, front to back, to side, transverse rotation and all that stuff. So SI joint movement, very important, but very minimal, right? But we have to understand what makes the minimal movement important is the fact that we're never moving in one plane in particular. And we'll talk a little bit more about planes here in a minute. So some people might, and some of you may have heard this reference, if you go to like a physical therapist and maybe you have some pain at the hip or pelvis, they go, oh, you might have a pelvic upslip is a word that you might hear, which kind of makes this like, hold on, my ilium just did like this. Like, let me tell you something. Unless you're 8.5 months pregnant, or you've been in like a severe motor vehicle accident, the likelihood that your part of your pelvis is just going to do this. I have one leg shorter than the other. It's like, whoa, let's pump the principal brakes here and let's see if we can apply some logic to that thinking, right? So big takeaway about SI joint, minimal movement, but what we call triaxial movement, or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Win for collagen vascular disorders will also accept Marfan's disease. If you guys have seen Marfan's disease, pretty wild. If you don't know what Marfan's disease looks like, go watch professional basketball, because like I'm pretty sure most of those dudes have it. So Ehlers-Danlos, for those of you guys following the chat, is what we call a collagen vascular disorder. It's like ligamentous laxity that would encase, definitely that person's pelvis would be able to move a little bit more freely than someone who doesn't have that diagnosis. Okay, so now here we have our landmarks. Big one as we move into joints is going to be the SI joint. Not that the femoral acetabular joint, I think, is less of a joint than the SI joint. One could argue with the freedom of movement, it's much more of a joint. But I think the SI joint, what trips a lot of people up is that it has this instantaneous axis of rotation. So as I flex my innominate bone or that side of my pelvis or that wing of my pelvis, it's not just moving in one direction. It's not just flexing, right? Or it's not just abducting, or it's not just, internally or externally rotating. It's always moving at all three at once. If it's moving at all three at once. Very similar to the shoulder blade. Shoulder blade has an instantaneous axis of rotation. So we talk about the shoulder blade sometimes and we go, oh, we're going to elevate the shoulder blade, or we're going to depress the shoulder blade, or we're going to protract or retract. It's not like a Harry Potter bone elevator, right? Like it has this kind of this instantaneous axis of rotation that as it flexes, it moves through these planes. As it internally and externally rotates, which can be a hard thing to conceptualize, it's going to move through all three planes at once, right? So joints, these are the two major ones that we're going to deal with. Honorable mention for lumbosacral joint, right? So where the sacrum articulates with the lumbar spine, that's going to be, in part a part of the pelvis. Now, the thing with this, and kind of going back to our original ankle analogy and shoulder analogy, is when we look at ankles, right? Bad rookie party hazing or good rookie party hazing, depending on who's wearing the diaper. We look at that and we go, oh, okay, so we're going to go get, I got an x-ray, which is for the foot and ankle, not bad, right? Because it's what we need to see is what if the structure is broken, what if the structure is damaged? So when I say structure, if we refer back to the slide in our brain, what are the bones and ligaments are broken in the foot? Because it's tearing muscles of the foot, albeit it happens, they're pretty small. So it's the big rocks are going to be the big rocks. But let's take a shoulder, right? So we have fracture to the shoulder. I have separated, so I've separated and dislocated. That's a whole thing. But my shoulders are fine. They don't really give me issues anymore because of all the function I have, right? All the muscles I have with all the tendons that I can control with my brain and do exercises and program a certain way and all that. So my ankle continually gives me problems. My shoulder, right now, my shoulders are probably the best they felt in, 8 years since I quit powerlifting, which if you want to feel good, stop powerlifting. And Lou can attest to that. So when I think about this, I go, okay, with shoulder, we kind of give we give it its flowers and be like, hey, shoulder function, right? Rotator cuff strengthening, stability, scapular strength and stability, serratus, this, that, and the third, Y's, T's, W's, nailing it. Good. You know what? But shoulder gets better. Ankle stuff, there's a Louis C.K. joke. If you guys like comedy, Louis C.K. is just you get to a certain age and there's nothing they can do. It's you just do these exercises. And I'm when do I get to stop them? He's no, you don't. You just have a shitty ankle now. That's the diagnosis. Now, when it comes to the lower back and pelvic region, oftentimes we too oftentimes look at the pelvis like an ankle. We go, you just kind of have shitty hips, or you just have kind of shitty low back. Sorry, you're just going to do these exercises and that's it. It's well, that kind of sucks, doesn't it? Where in part, it's actually somewhere in between, both physically, obviously, it's right between your feet and your shoulders, which is kind of nice for this comparison. But from the function of structure function, or from the perspective, of structure and function, it is kind of somewhere in the middle, right? So what we're going to talk about is what are some guiding principles to help us understand the function, right? So that we can start to improve on some of the tightness that we might be having, or might be improving on some of our inability to recruit particular muscles and grow them, right? So that's going to be whether it's performance, whether it's pain and rehabilitation, with body composition and muscle mass. Those are going to be the big goals in any training program. So it's we understand the structure now. Now we got to understand the function. The hard part about the function of the pelvis, it's it's a lot. A lot. So if we kind of run down a quick list here, here's some honorable mentions. So the psoas. Notice how I didn't write hip flexor. I wrote psoas. Hip flexion is a particular range of motion that the psoas is helpful for, but not the best. I don't think the psoas is the best hip flexor. It's a whole conversation for another time. Iliacus, another part of the hip flexor group. Rectus femoris, part of the quad, also hip flexor. The hamstring group, right? So if we're going to go deep dive on that, that's semimembranosus, semitendinosus, bicep femoris, long and short head. your adductors. That's 5 different muscles right there. So pectineus, adductor brevis, adductor longus, adductor magnus, and sartorius. And then we have the abdominals. That's going to attach onto the pelvis. So if we think about the internal, external oblique, transverse abdominis, and rectus abdominis, that's going to attach on it. Your hip rotators, right? So there's like a rotator cuff in our shoulder gets a lot of press, right? So we, some of you may be familiar with supraspinatus and infraspinatus and teres minor and subscapularis, and like, oh, the rotator cuff. We kind of have that in the hip, but no one ever talks about it because the hip has way more what we call structural stability, right? It has a little less freedom of movement, unless you're fucking gold member, whipping that. That's an Austin Powers reference. If your birthday has a 2 in the year, you probably don't get it, which is like, makes the second I do this and someone doesn't get the old gold member reference with the rollerblades, I think you boys out the game for good. So hopefully, yes, thank you for being born in with a 19 in it. I'll take a 19 anything. 2004, forget about it. You're not going to get the gold member reference, and I'm not learning your TikTok videos to make a reference for you guys to understand. I'm going with gold member to the death because it was like probably one of the greatest movies of all time. So do yourself a favor, homework. Hey, what'd you learn that webinar you watched last night? I got to watch this movie called Austin Powers Gold Member. And you know what? You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank me later. jshallow@pre-script.com. I expect an email. Okay. So hip rotator group. It's kind of like the rotator cuff, but we don't hear about it because our bones keep our hips so stable, right? There's no ball in socket. Thank you. There's more ball in socket than in the shoulder. Shoulder's like not a ball. It is a ball and socket joint, sure, but it's really more of like a golf ball and a tee, right? So we need that. We need that extra muscle. That's why we get a lot of play. We talk about the rotator cuff so much. Hip rotators. Ready? We're gonna go real quick. Superior, inferior gemellus, right? Piriformis, obturator, internus, externus, quadratus femoris. There's 6 muscles that we call the hip rotator group. That's them. Watch it back, write it down if you're so inclined, right? This is big. Pelvic diaphragm. I said I was going to talk about this in the landing page for the thing. So here we are. We're talking about it now. Notice the wording. The wording is big. You know what I didn't say? I didn't say pelvic floor. Pelvic floor, it gets weird out there. Like it gets weird. I don't know if you guys are on the internet, but when the pelvic floor is on the internet, it gets strange. Keep stuff out of there. But if we look at the pelvic floor, like the pelvic diaphragm, you go, wait a minute, I've heard about the diaphragm before, but not in the pelvis. Like, right, you heard about the thoracic diaphragm. And guess what? The thoracic diaphragm and the pelvic diaphragm, they work in tandem and they have very similar functions, and they're actually reciprocal with one another, right? So rather than looking at like, oh, I have a weak pelvic floor, it's like maybe your pelvic floor is just not lining up with the homie upstairs. And that may be a deity, and you maybe want to pick up some philosophy or religion, but maybe the homie upstairs is actually the thoracic diaphragm. And when those two are vibing, things work pretty well. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about, and look, pelvis and rib cage are they're almost like these analogous type things. And sometimes we look at the pelvis and we're like, oh, it kind of can expand and compress a little bit like a rib cage, but not super a lot. But when we look at a rib cage and we go like, wow, the rib cage is just one thing. It's like, not really. The rib cage is 2 things. There's a left and a right rib cage. It's like, whoa, well, fuck. So it's cool, man. But I think one of the lines you want to learn to draw when we start talking about lower body, and look, like I'm setting questions you back into the world with questions. And like, I want you to think about the pelvic diaphragm, right? Think about what happens when I take a breath in. Well, what's my thoracic diaphragm doing? So my thoracic diaphragm, when I inhale, is contracting, and it's lowering concentrically, right? It's contracting like a bicep would contract, and it pulls the lungs and creates this negative pressure. But like, what's homie in the basement doing? It's like the homie in the basement is lowering eccentrically, so that my thoracic diaphragm is concentrically lowering, while my pelvic diaphragm is eccentrically lowering. So it's kind of lengthening to accommodate for that pressure as it pushes down. Now, what about an exhalation? Well, if I exhale, the opposite's happening. Now I'm getting this eccentric rising or relaxation of the thoracic diaphragm. But if I give a sharp exhale or a brace, all of a sudden now that's going to contract the pelvic floor concentrically, right? So we kind of get this relationship, this little elevator relationship going on. That's huge. A lot of times people are looking at pelvic floor issues and there's just sticking stuff in there. It's like, yo, I mean, party on, Garth. But if we think that we're making considerable changes, like maybe we're just not managing pressure properly. Maybe our rib cage needs to be more over our pelvis, and then our pelvic floor issues. It's not so much our pelvic floor needs to be strong, rather our pelvic diaphragm needs to be in a better position and have less force applied to it to begin with. So that's right. Yeah, write that. Watch it back. Right. It's like, why do the book report on, To Kill a Mockingbird when they got the flick, right? You can just watch it back. You take notes as it comes in. You're just going to have the sultry sounds of me yelling about the pelvic floor right now, so you don't have to watch this again. All right, so that's a little bit about function, but obviously there's more, right? There's much more. We haven't talked about the tensor fasciae lata. We haven't really talked about the iliotibial band or like the glute med or even the glute max. There's a lot going on here, but again, we're going to keep a high level at the principles perspective. So one thing that we need to understand is, so there's an axiom that goes around fitness, and the axiom reads, structure dictates function. That's what some people might see, right? So let's talk about, when we were like, hey, your hip socket depth and your femur neck length might make it so that you squat a certain way. It's like, yeah, maybe. Or if you've just learned how to squat, maybe what's stopping you from squatting is you don't know how to squat, and that's nothing to do with your ancestors and what part of the world you're from, right? Like more people are probably on the middle of this bell curve than the end, because that's how bell curves work, right? So its structure might indicate function. There's going to be some things we talk about later that dictate function, but it's not structure. Structure can indicate function. Like, well, yeah, maybe, but have you tried trying? So we're going to do that. We're going to try trying. So that's structure indicates function, right? So that's sort of the axiom we're going to leave with in our structure function relationships for today. Is like, okay, we need to know the structure, but we need to know the function. So we need to do a little bit of a deeper dive. Like, well, what does the psoas do, right? Well, what does the glute do? Like, how do these things function? So we'll kind of leave that and then go into the next sub chapter here. So locomotion, this principle, it's part evolutionary biology, it's part biomechanics, it's part physics. It's what makes us apex predators is our ability to propel through space very efficiently, right? Like, so I don't know if you've ever been to Kenya or parts of Africa where they had to historically hunt lions. What makes that feat possible is that we're upright, we're bipedal, which is different than like a lot of apex predators, at least land ones, because we walk around on two legs, and big scary animals like lions and tigers, they walk around on four. Now, there's something that happens when you walk around on four legs as opposed to two legs. Your diaphragm goes from being vertical, right? So when we're up on two legs, like we talked about, our diaphragms, the rib cage and pelvis, are stacked. And us moving through space, so if I were to like walk towards the camera, my diaphragm is not running like this, running like this, right? So I can kind of trot along, and I don't have to breathe every time I take a step. Even when I'm in powerlifting, I don't have to do it. Sometimes I do because I'm out of shape, but I don't have to. If you're a tiger running, or if you're a lion or a horse running, you have to, right? So locomotion is like a really interesting system that we've come up with that allows us to be very, very energy efficient. Now, it would behoove us as people who might be, exercise enthusiasts of some sort, trainers, coaches, physical therapists, what have you, enough to sit in on a half hour. We're half hour still over 100. Yay, team. But understanding locomotion. Now, here's the thing. Understanding it means understanding where it's not applicable. The last thing I want coming out of this webinar is people going like, oh, what we know about the gait cycle, and then everything's just the gait cycle now. It's like, pump the brakes. And I'll tell you how to pump the brakes in gait cycle. I'll tell you how to decelerate. But when we look at gait cycle, there's some things that like we want to take away, and some principles we want to take away from gait cycle. So we're going to hone in on like one or two that are really important that have to do primarily with the pelvis, because gait cycle has implications at the foot, has implications at the tibia, has implications at the joining tibia, the femur, at the knee joint. Well, we're going to talk about like, well, what can gait cycle tell us about the pelvis? Right. So we kind of learned a little bit about the pelvis. We understand its rough structure function. It's like, okay, now what do we do with it? Right. Well, there's a lot of really low barrier of entry things that we can look at to improve movements of our lower body by just addressing some core principles we learn from locomotion, right? And how does this evolved process that we go through to get around and stay alive? What can it tell us about the way we efficiently move, right? So what locomotion can really tell us is it can teach us about the planes. So not the planes in the Serengeti, but like the planes of motion, right? So when I say planes of motion, what I mean by that is sagittal, frontal, transverse, and we'll go into those in detail because I was the better part of a decade in postgraduate studies, not really understanding what that meant. So bear with me, trust me. When you get good at the language, you'll start to understand. It makes it super easy to communicate, super easy to conceptualize things in higher resolution, which makes you more efficient at solving more difficult problems. And the thing about difficult problems is people pay you money to solve them. So yay, team. So it teaches locomotion, can teach us a little bit the planes of motion. It can teach us about the purposes of different phases of gait, right? So let's look at the planes first. Sagittal, frontal, transverse. Look, your boy went through it. Sometimes, depending on where you go to school, some of you may have seen the words, if you've seen this before, rather than frontal, you may have seen the word coronal. And it's like, it's just like miles per hour in kilometers. Like we're just going to switch those up depending on where we're at. Like it's tough out there, right? So sagittal, let's break this down. I want to make this real English. I find the picture of the people that with the lines through them makes it harder for me. Sagittal plane is anything flexion extension, right? So flex the bicep curl, sagittal plane exercise. Front raise, right? Doing a dumbbell front raise, sagittal plane exercise. Squatting. Now, there's quite literally some dimension to this. Straight leg raise. Let's think of just a straight leg raise or leg raises as an exercise, like some sort of core exercise, sagittal plane, right? Hip flexion, elbow flexion, shoulder flexion, knee extension flexion, all of these, anything that goes front to back, we would call a sagittal plane exercise, right? Now, frontal, this is key. And this is where we're going to dig in on gait cycle just a little bit. And this is where when we talk about just takeaways, things that we can like immediately apply to our training that we may not have overlooked, but our principles-based approach and maybe improving lower body mechanics very simply with applying some of these things that we learned about gait cycle. Frontal plane is big. So frontal plane is side to side. Right now, you may be thinking side to side, like lateral lunges. It's like, well, maybe, kind of ish. We'll talk about why frontal plane is so important. And lastly, we have the transverse plane. Transverse plane is rotation, right? So anything spinning, right? This transverse plane, right? This transverse plane, right? So rotation, transverse plane. Now, these movements are very interesting in the way they organize. So you kind of see this like, all right, let's pose a question. If we were to turn on a highlight reel right now, if we were to turn on ESPN or TSN or wherever you guys are in the world, I don't know what the equivalent of that is in Singapore. I'm sorry. But like we were to put on like a highlight reel, especially this time of year. And it was like plays of the night. Plays of the night in sports are usually high velocity, which means very fast, transverse plane movements. I have not maybe once when Ray Williams squatted like 1,000 pounds, saw powerlifting on there, but usually like dunk contest. It's Tony Hawk pro skater without the skateboard now. Some guy is just jumping with a basketball. It's like, why? High velocity. It's going very, very, very fast and it's rotating, right? What's the most boring thing to watch? Powerlifting, probably, right? Low velocity, predominantly sagittal plane. Like your hips are flexing and extending and it's kind of slow if it's really heavy. So it's like, okay, our body tends to have a more difficult time operating in the transverse plane, right? Transverse plane is harder. It's just, a lot of it has to do with how our head kind of exists in space and the vestibular system. And if I start moving my head around, I kind of get a little bit disoriented. So sagittal plane is very simple. And we see this, right? Like if you've ever seen, like someone elderly walk, you'll notice that they lose a lot of rotation. They might start to waddle side to side. It's like, yeah, because they actually can't rotate as well as they used to, right? So they kind of adopt this more simple strategy of getting around, which simplicity comes from when we move from transverse to frontal to sagittal. Complexity comes when we move the opposite direction, right? So if I need to make a movement more complex, I'll move it from sagittal to frontal. And if I need to make it more complex again, I'll move it from frontal to transverse, right? There's plenty of different examples that we could talk about this, but I want to talk about how this pertains to gait cycle, right? So if we look at gait cycle, there's three kind of purposes of gait cycle, and it's kind of true of like muscles in general, right? So gait cycle has three main components to it. Now we could zoom out and be like, well, gait cycle has two phases, right? So the two phases of gait cycle are going to be early stance, mid stance, and late stance. So that's part of the stance phase. So zoom all the way out. We have stance phase, which means, hey, there's one leg on the ground. And then we have the other part of the cycle, which is swing phase. Hey, we have a foot in the ground. And between going and alternating between what we call stance phase on one leg with a leg on the ground and swing phase with the leg in the air, And we have a like 10% called double support phase in between, where if you're walking, we have both feet on the ground, right? So we're finishing terminal stance on the one side while we're adopting early stance on the other side, right? So we call that the double support phase. And then as my heel touches the ground, I'm absorbing force and everything that comes with that biomechanically up into the knee and the tibia and the pelvis and so on. And then when I solely am on one foot, right? So as I've shifted, and this is going to be really big, when I'm in, what we call mid stance, I'm in a good position to produce force. And then as I go into late stance, that's where I transfer force, right? So when we look at these two, and we go, okay, sagittal frontal transverse, and the purpose of gait cycle is to absorb, produce, and transfer force. One of the things that I think is really important as like a good place to start is what are the issues we have primarily, right? When it comes to the pelvis, when it comes to lower body, it's like one of the biggest ones that we're going to have is a hip shift, right? So a hip shift can be very daunting to people. Like, oh, I don't understand what's happening. Do I have a leg length indiscrepancy? Am I stronger on my one side? So look, your body is just a series of like electrical impulses, right? Driven through mechanotransduction and charges and ions, and it's just as this storm in your head, and it's synapses and nerve endings and all that. If you ever look at lightning, you ever see it hit something, hopefully it's something, hopefully it's not someone, and you watch the trajectory that lightning takes the path of least resistance. When it comes to completing tasks in your body with your nervous system, central and peripheral, it's finding the path of least resistance. So we could surmise that if we see a hip shift, and this is like a very narrow lens to look through, but I think, in the interest of trying to talk to 98 strangers without seeing their face about a topic that I'm unsure of their baseline knowledge of, I'm going to try and give a few very practical takeaways of like, okay. And then a few hopefully higher level principle takeaways where those who might be a little bit further along can start to really chew on and maybe find some interesting solutions for problems that might be having. So that being said, the hip shift, path of least resistance, the lightning. If I see someone shifting to one side of their squat, what that tells me, and how I know this or how I'm getting to this conclusion is I'm getting to it through the principles of gait cycle. What that tells me is they're shifting towards the side that has more internal rotation, right? Because they are not being able to sort of capture or access the range of motion on the other side. And in order to produce force, we need to be able to internally rotate. Gait cycle taught us that. Now let's think about that really quickly. I'm going to bring the mic. I wonder how far I can bring it. Is that as far as I can go? Yes. Okay. So hopefully you can still hear me. I'm back here now, and this offers no strategic advantage. Okay. So as I take a step forward towards the camera, okay, so my left leg is forward. In order for me to advance towards you, I need to be able to move my pelvis through the frontal plane, right? I need to be able to move it to the side. Now, in order for this to happen, in order for this to be achieved in a fruitful and productive manner, is as I'm taking this step forward and I take my left foot and I step forward and I want to advance now into mid stance. So now, oh, okay, this one is swinging, right? So I'm in swing phase of my right leg. In order for that to be useful, we need to think about what happens at the pelvis in what we call the closed chain, right? So when we hear the importance of what we call internal rotation of the hip, sometimes we can get into the habit of like trying to improve internal rotation of the hip by like thinking about just the hip, right? Thinking about the leg moving on a femur that's fixed, or sorry, the leg moving on a pelvis that's fixed. But what we need to do is we need to think about relative internal rotation. So let's take this mic, for example. Okay, so this mic, imagine this is the end of my femur, right? So I'm going to talk into it, make sure you still hear me. So this is my femur head. It kind of like has this inward trajectory. And this, my hand, is the socket, right? So if I have this mic, the femur head that's sitting in the socket, and I wanted to create rotation, right? Some people will be like, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to do this. And I'm going to take my leg and rotate it inside my acetabular or inside my belt. It's like, okay, sure. Problem with that is, look, I've had some squats get away from me in my life, but never once have I ended up doing some like Michael Jackson Thriller shit with my leg in the air, right? That's not how we're trying to get down. We need the foot on the ground. So how is it that we create internal rotation of the hip while our foot stays on the ground, while our femur face fixed? We need to be able to shift, right? We need to be able to shift that center of mass over the base support, which is a concept we'll talk about here in a second. So in order to do that, we need the ilium to be able to move through the frontal plane, right? So when we look at like unilateral lower body movements, for example, so here we have on the left, I have some sort of low step up to, like a step class step, which that could obviously raise up higher and higher and higher, but it could also go lower, something like a front foot elevated split squat down to a bumper plate. Then on the right, what we have is we have a Bulgarian split squat, right? So it's like, I want you to see these exercises on the continuum in which they exist, right? So in the one exercise, we have the front foot up. And then the other exercise, we have the back foot up. This will be something that we revisit because it's really, really important to understand how the parameter of the exercise that we're choosing affects the center of mass, right? So that becomes really important. Now, with the step up and with the Bulgarian, but let's stick with the step up, for example, because I find this one like most commonly bastardized. In order, based off of mid-stance mechanics, in order for this person to be able to produce produce force into the box, they need to be able to shift their weight to the side, right? So when we're talking about unilateral movements, so unilateral means like one leg at a time, right? We need to have the pelvis able to move. And there's a really common archaic adage of like, and I see it every day. I go into this big box gym here in Toronto and I watch trainers train their clients and they like try to stop their client's pelvis from moving to the side. So let's like imagine this for a second, right? So if I'm here and I'm stepping up here, we got the stool, right? In order for me, just like gait cycle, right? Just like I was walking towards you before, in order for me to come at you, I need to get this hip over. And now as I bring my as I bring my pelvis through the frontal plane, I need to make sure that I keep 10 toes down. I need to keep my foot locked in the same place. So if I do that, if I keep my foot in the same place and I keep equal foot pressure into the ground and I move my pelvis off to the side, what will have happened inherently was I will have created internal rotation of my hip. And internal rotation of my hip is how I'm going to produce force into the ground. So what I will see sometimes, and it's really frustrating to see because I feel bad for the client, because it's like they're asking them to perform just really an impossible task, is they'll see trainers do this step up right next to a wall, right? So if I had a wall right here, right down my side, I couldn't get my hip out and I couldn't create internal rotation. I go, you got a real weak glute there. We're going to have to work on it. So what are you talking about? How? You can't create internal rotation to produce force in the ground, right? So imagine this, right? So imagine I grew up in Windsor. So, basically like little Hamilton, shout out my homie from Hamilton. So like, and Hicksville, like you got to fight we're just trying to survive out here. And I'll tell you what, I didn't win a lot. You get hurt less. I think that's how you win fights as a kid. But I never went into a fight and externally rotated as I hit someone, right? Externally rotated. That'd be a really silly way to fight. If you watch someone box or if you've ever thrown a punch, you know that like, okay, I'm going to try and internally rotate my shoulder. Internal rotation is consistent with force production and external rotation is consistent with force absorption. So some of these principles right away, you're like, hold on, maybe, and look, if your knees are too far in, then the cue knees out works, but only if it's bringing us to a position where we're maximally able to produce force into the ground. A lot of times we cue things like knees out, or we talk about these weak glutes, but we're putting people in bad positions. So what do we want to take away from gait cycle? Look, there's a lot, right? We haven't gone into eversion and inversion and pronation and supination of the foot. These are all very straight lines we can draw to improving mechanics. But let's talk about the big rocks. Big rocks, force production. Great. Let's look at the most efficient system we have at producing force. Gait cycle. What does that tell us? Frontal plane movements are like super useful, right? And like what would have frontal plane movements can be something like a side bend. Right now, so people are like, oh, I'm doing a side blend for my obliques. It's like, yeah, maybe or your QLs or whatever, but maybe you're just getting your pelvis moving. Maybe if I do a side bend and I can keep both of my feet on the ground, then I'm actually creating a great amount of internal rotation, right? By keeping my femur fixed in place and having my pelvis move around the femur that's fixed. And then I go to squat. I feel way better. Oh, it must have been your obliques. It's like, no, maybe it could be that, yeah, your obliques were limiting your pelvis's ability to move and create internal rotation, but like, that's a super useful thing to know, right? So like just take an inventory of like all the exercise that your clients like before they do things like squats and deadlifts and lunges and things like that. And as long as you allow for, especially in unilateral settings, single leg settings, for that frontal plane movement to happen, and before you train them, you try and just give them some awareness of the frontal plane. Like think of foam rolling the iliotibial band. So here we have someone sidelined with a bolster under their leg. Is the benefit the pressure? Maybe, yeah, free nerve endings, Pacinian corpuscles, Meisner's corpuscles, Merkel's disc, Ruffini endings. Like there's a science to mechanoreception that is not to be discounted, but like maybe it's just like kind of throwing the hip off to the side a little bit, right? Maybe we're just actually creating some frontal plane pelvic movement. And those side crunches you're doing, it's like, yeah, obliques, sure, but maybe you're just getting your pelvis moving a little bit. And if you're not, maybe you should try, right? So like we're, again, big principle stuff, a little bit of application, try it. Try before your next lower body day. Let's just think about moving the pelvis side to side. Well, as I do it, keeping my feet squarely on the ground, right? Because if I move my pelvis side to side and my foot starts doing this, it's like, well, my femur is kind of just rocking with the ilium. It's like, well, I want to create that relative rotation where I need this to stick, and then I need the pelvis to move independent to a femur. So that's fixed on the ground, right? So that's sort of like principle number two. So we talk about structure function relationships. We're like, hey, look, let's not be so quick to look at the lumbar spine disc. I'm not saying don't get an MRI, but like, can we find a gold standard of functional assessment? Can we start to consider some of these, more rudimentary, fundamental principles of movement and see how they can apply and just try, just try. Nothing, not going to hurt for trying. Let's just try to see if we get a little bit of frontal plane movement, create a bit of internal rotation, and see how things work. Let your clients move into these positions, right? Let the hip come out as you do the step up. It's indicative of the internal rotation that's occurring. So, party on. We're going to move into bilateral movements now. So talk a little bit about unilateral movements. When we talk about bilateral movements, it's going to be the most prevalent example of the principle of center of mass. Now, center of mass, what is center of mass? Well, center of mass is the combination of forces, the sum of all forces acting in and on the body. Okay, so it's really useful to know how someone carries their center of mass. It's kind of like this equilibrium point that people kind of hang on to, right? So if, like, say, when I was a competitive powerlifter, I was a little bit heavier, right? So my center of mass would be a little bit more forward because I was a little bit more rotund around the midsection. And then, as I lose weight for a meet and I cut down, my center of mass changes and my leverage is changes and my timing changes, right? So center of mass is an internal and an external thing, and we'll talk about that. And because the reason center of mass becomes important now, center of mass is like meta important. Everything we talked about so far, and we might, if we have a bit of time, which we'll see, I might be able to sneak a little bit over. We might be able to talk about how center of mass gets affected by some of the unilateral positions, the step up and the Bulgarian, right? So we can talk about center of mass. The sum of forces acting in and on the body, right? What is the net position? Now, if I'm standing here, I'm gonna stand up for you. It's because, you guys couldn't figure this out. This is what I look like standing, right? I'm standing. If I'm standing here, my center of mass, if I were to like draw it as a point, is probably like behind my belly button towards my spine, because as long as I'm not falling over and I don't have anything considerably heavy in my hands, the microphone's not that bad, my center of mass is in between my base of support. The more well and true that relationship is, the more passively stable I am. I don't need to use a lot of energy. Now, if I were to try and pull some like this shit, right? So I'm not falling over yet, but my center of mass is way far forward, but I'm expending a lot of energy, right? I'm like using my calves and my hamstring, my glutes and my erectors to stop me from falling over. So there's a constant inventory of how our body is controlling our center of mass, which drastically is going to affect the position of the pelvis. Now, position dictates function. Structure only indicates it. So position, right, is going to be dictated by the combined center of mass and our awareness to control it. So center of mass is like a really useful concept. Now, not much we do in the gym I would consider as very athletic. Because what I like about athletes, what are the best athletes in the world? Like, look, I'm not a big fight person, too old flesh shit, but I like mixed martial art. Right now, I like mixed martial art, not because it's bloody and all this Coliseum shit. I like it because they display a feature of athleticism that I like. Now, I would say that athletes are, by definition, people who can learn motor skills very well and very quickly. That usually makes a really good athlete. Like I watched my niece when she was like a year and a half old take my iPad, spend a bunch of money on my credit card. And then 2 weeks later, I watched Leonard Fournette do this exercise I gave him, and I was like, that was the same fucking thing, right? Her ability to learn cognitively is on par with his ability to learn physically, right? And so that's what athletes are. They can learn motor skills very, very fast. But what I like about fighters in particular, and running backs, it's a dogfight out there. So shout out Lenny, Lambo Lenny, go Bills. That's how confusing the Bills playbook is. That Lenny plays under Brady and then goes to Buffalo, and it's like, dog, like what the fuck are we doing here? This is nuts. Okay, so position dictates function. Understanding how people carry their center of mass is step number one in building athleticism, because we have there's like three types of people ish. Bear with me. There's like an untrained individual who does not know how to control their center of mass. There is someone who knows how to control their center of mass, and there's someone who knows how to control their center of mass, and somebody else's. There's 100 people here right now, so there might be some people out there who practice the modern art of the ancient art of jujitsu, which is like, hey man, there's like purple belts out there that can choke me out as soon as looking at me. I don't want no smoke. But I do have a gripe with all of my friends who do jujitsu who use this line. Ready? Wait for it. Wait for it. My friends that do jujitsu go, I can use your strength against you. It's like my strength would never betray me. It wouldn't do that. Me and my strength are tight. But what they mean to say is they can use my center of mass against me. They can get it so that my center of mass is outside of my base of support. Now my strength stands for nothing. Right? It's like the hot gates in 300. Like I'm completely useless. My numbers count for nothing. Right? I'm basically Xerxes with a bunch of muscle marching at the hot gates of people who can control the environment. Right? So that's where those people become really dangerous. If you guys have ever, it's such a good book. I think it's called The Art of Learning by Josh Waitskins. It's a really interesting book about a chess prodigy that gets into push hands Tai Chi, which is like, it's super interesting. So gold member and The Art of Learning by Josh Waitskins. It's dynamic. We're Renaissance. We're trying to be cultured here. Okay. So what are we talking about? Center of mass. Center of mass can affect position. Position is going to dictate function. So what do we mean by that? It's like, okay, if we look at this is Nelson Aguilar. It's a couple of seasons ago. I think he was still playing with the Patriots. I told Nelson, he's wide receiver for the Baltimore Ravens right now. I was like, I need you to squat and I need you to deadlift. And I'm going to take a picture at the bottom position and then use this in a webinar years later. And he goes, whatever. And he's looking at me like, what are we doing? They're more alike than they are different. Right. So what is a squat? Right. So if we're talking a little bit higher level, and we're going to try and target some tissues in our lower body, and we're going to, try and equate a program that allows us to accurately, with some degree of accuracy, understand what tissues we're loading. Right. So a squat is more of a vertical translation of the pelvis. Right. So the position of the pelvis is that it is positioned in such a way where it can allow itself to move vertically in space. But a deadlift is more horizontal, right? So a deadlift, the pelvis moves back to front, and in a squat, the pelvis moves up and down. It's like that meme from The Office. I'm not a big Office fan, but like it's that meme that goes around of like they're the same picture. Like, hey, head office needs you to find the difference between these photos, and they go, they're the same thing. Look, for all intents and purposes, those are the same photo. Those are the same movement, right? The funny thing is, he actually gets more hip flexion on his, or he gets a better position. He gets less posterior translation of his hip when he's deadlifting. On the picture on the right, he's got his hands down, indicating that's his deadlift starting position. And it's just a disaster, this movement, like right down to the toes. If you look at his toes and consider his foot contact, like his pinky toes are rolling up, and it's like, okay, how do we get in a place like this? Because this is not, so it's very far off from a client that you'll train in a big box gym. But positionally, it might be exactly the same. I had someone email me about an issue they had with tight calves, and they sent me a squat that looked like the one on the left. It's like, well, you don't have tight calves. You couldn't possibly know that. Your shin angle isn't forward enough unless you had a really bad rookie party experience and you amped up your ankle. It can't possibly be your calves, right? Your tightness is coming from your center of mass is carried so far forward that you can't keep your center of mass inside of your base of support. Your body feels like it's falling over. Right. So in this case, it's like happens a lot in the sport of football, actually, right? So if we think of deadlifting and squatting, where squatting is probably going to be more of a as the pelvis moves vertically, a squat should probably involve a little bit more knee extension than hip extension. Now, we've seen this in research of what muscles grow proportionally. So, like the 12-week squat study done in Brazil, 2020, we're going to see the quads grow probably like, I don't know, it was like 12.2%, and the glutes grow like 9.3% or something like that. So like a 25% increase more in knee extension dominant moment in a squat if we're moving, more up and down than back to front, than if we were to move back to front in a hinge, right? So if we were to hinge more, we'd be looking at, well, what brings the pelvis from back to front? It's like, well, that's going to be more glute, maybe more adductor, depending on the angle. It may be a bit of hamstring. The problem with this is, we could tell him in season, like, hey, I want you to squat this many times a week and I want you to deadlift this many times a week. But if I'm looking at a pelvis and like think about looking at the pelvis and see where it's going, that pelvis is just moving horizontally, right? So it's like, well, he's loading the same tissues. So the squat, it offers me no advantage of the deadlift. I mean, a minor advantage here and there, but not the level of variability that I'm looking for to load different tissues, right? Because the center of mass is forward. He's carrying a center of mass forward. So I'm going to have to do things here to, if I want variability and loading in the off season, and I want to, or like, let's say we bring it into the aesthetic space out of the sports performance world, I want them to have more glute or more quad and know which one I'm loading. It's like, well, okay, if I need more quad, I need to have him control his center of mass. First off, when we see people like this, and you will see a lot of people like this, because undertrained and overtrained people, I would consider Nelson overtrained. He's very particularly skilled at the sport of football. He's having a great season with Baltimore too. His center of mass is forward. He's always carrying his center of mass forward. Why? Because that's where the end zone is. The end zone is over there. It's rarely, unless he's in it, under his feet. So he's not really good at moving his pelvis up and down. He's good at moving it front to back. So much so that when I asked him to squat, he can't move his pelvis up and down. He's still trying to move his pelvis back to front. So it's like, well, I need to push his center of mass backwards to give him a little bit more knee extension, to give him, or knee flexion extension, to give him a little bit more quad, right? So I could sit there and just try and drill him like, no, got to keep chest, and I could stretch his calves and hamstrings till the cows come home. Or I could be like, hey, I'm going to implement tools that are going to inherently have you shift your center of mass back. So for example, elevating the heels. Elevating the heels, everyone's like, oh, it increases your ankle range of motion. No, stop saying that. It's not true. What it does is it helps you better understand your center of mass. So here's what it does. If I go to a hill and I run up it, I look like Nelson, right? I look like my butt is back, my chest is forward, and I'm running uphill. If I were to run downhill like Nelson right now, I would fall over. So what are heel elevations? Heel elevations are little hills. We put people on little hills. Why? So their body automatically arranges itself in such a way where they're like, whoa, Nelly, quite literally. And they start to keep a more upright spine. How else could I do that? So I had to severely elevate his heels. I'm talking like that 45-pound bumper plate. We put one of those under each of his heels. Still wasn't enough. I had him up on fucking stilettos right away. Like basically had, almost the equivalent of like a 45 and a 25-pound bumper. We're talking like 4 inches of heel elevation, pretty steep angle. If you got wedges, those work. We could talk a little bit about that at a later time. But I gave him an anterior load, also pushes the center of mass back, and the heel elevation inherently pushes the center of mass back. When I did that, then he could start to drop up and down. And wouldn't you know it, after I've done that with the 25-pound plate and the 45-pound plate, I dropped it down to just the 45-pound plate. And then I dropped it down to the 25-pound plate. So he went from having an inability to move his pelvis up and down. And then we just kind of tweaked the position, and it tweaked his perception of where he was in space. Now we can start to effectively load tissues. And guess what? As he got stronger, he was able to control his own center of mass better. He was able to actually start squatting again and training the squat to have variable position of the pelvis to move vertically rather than horizontally. That allows him to overload his knees and underload his back. It gives him more options on the field. Because if we're in a controlled setting in the gym, and I tell him to do 2 distinctly different exercises and he does the same thing, what do you think his body's going to do on the field? What position is Nelson going to resort to all the time? It's going to be something that looks like this. And if we're training in season and he has no variability, easy, Lou, be good. If he has no variability in movement, he's going to be loading chronically into the tissues. And what tissues is he loading into? He's loading into his hamstring. He's loading into his calf, knock, Achilles. Yeah, maybe we just don't load it all the time. We actually let it recover. It's not about getting stronger hamstrings. It's about decreasing the applied force to the posterior chain by keeping our center of mass inside our base of support. That allows us to be more efficient, and it allows us to conserve our tissues and actually recover in between bouts. These guys might go in. Now, Ravens have a good strength program now to understand, but some people might be like, well, we got to make sure that these hamstrings and the ACLs, and they go in and they train hamstrings and then they squat. And then it's like, dude, there's too much. You got to stop. It's all about center of mass, right? So we got to understand, like, hey, look, when we look at big principles, and this is just some takeaways, right? Like, so let's go big picture here. Understand structure function relationship. I didn't talk a single muscular insertion or origin or anything. You get all that from Wikipedia. You want to know that the adductor magnus 90% attached on the ischial tuberosity. Sure, you go look that up. That's fine. I want you to see things from the bigger picture. Right? I want you to see things from like, all right, when I look at a pelvis, what am I looking at? Where is the ischial tuberosity? Where is the sacrum? How does the SI joint sort of move this instantaneous axis of rotation? How much freedom of movement do I have? What are my potential structural limitations? Where are my abilities to outfunction bad structure? Then when we look at locomotion, well, what can locomotion teach us about gait cycles? What can locomotion teach us about exercise? It can teach us strategically how to absorb, produce, and transfer force. The big rocks, in a lot of cases, how do we produce force? Now, in some cases, Lenny actually being one of them, we might want to learn, how do we decelerate? How do we absorb force? That's big for someone who runs as fast as him. But most of your Gen Pop clients and trainers, or most of your Gen Pop clients in big box gyms are like, hey, we gotta learn how to produce force better, and position dictates that. So some frontal plane movement, some manipulation of center of mass with applied load, and heel elevation, understanding that squatting is moving the pelvis up and down. That's going to allow you to get more quad dominant, right? And more knee flexion extension. It's going to allow you to target those tissues in sort of this synchronized fashion with a long runway of progression. Shout out Killian Hamilton. If you ever hear the word runway of progression, that came out of Killian Hamilton's mouth first. Then, if we look at hinging, it's like, okay, if I want to load my hip extensors, my adductors, my hamstrings, and my glutes, I'm going to need a pelvis that can move backwards in space pretty well. So understanding how center of mass affects position is everything. How is it that our skeleton and our nervous system, from structure to function, interact with the external environment, right? We can see these like bonus round. This is a bonus round for those of you still sticking around. So we have 45-degree low back extension and a hip thrust. I know I'm over time, but stay with me. So we have a 45-degree low back extension is in what we would call the prone position, right? So the chest is more or less facing the ground at the peak point of torque. Where if we look at the hip thrust, it's in the supine position. Now, both of these, from a muscular perspective, where we look at resistance profile and strength curve, can train the glute in the more fully shortened position. Slightly different than the way that the resistance profile is applied. But the position of the skeleton relative to the center of the earth and the applied load is going to make such a difference on how it is that we actually prescribe this exercise. So what do I mean by that? In order for the glute to be the dominant hip extender, the pelvis should probably be situated nice and square under the rib cage, which means we should be in a more stacked position. Our diaphragm should be adjacent, right? Pelvic and thoracic diaphragm should be adjacent. That'll allow us to get uncompensated hip extension, which we don't have that much. We don't have a ton of hip extension, like 30 degrees max. So if we think of these two exercises, we go, right, I want my rib cage stacked over my pelvis as a prerequisite to extending my hip and using my glute. And we go, okay, it's also a fully shortened exercise, which means for those of you uninitiated, fully shortened exercises like a bicep curl up here or one of these two hip extension exercises, fully shortened exercises aren't really loadable, right? A squat or a leg press or a hinge would be more than mid-range to lengthen. That's where you can start moving some weight. So the idea of this is like, well, let's really isolate the glutes. But given how center of mass is affected by the internal and external environment of these two exercises, we can surmise that one might be a little bit easier for someone to maintain the position, understanding the intersection of the skeleton and the orientation of gravity, right? So at the hip thrust is actually a little bit more difficult for novice people to get a hold of, because the first thing that's going to break down is their ability to stay stacked. As people get a little bit more fatigued in the 45-degree low back extension, because their torso is facing the ground, they're in a position where they're biasing a more rib cage stacked position so they can push that hip extension in the ideal position for longer because they don't have to co-contract, right? If the dumbbell's on your waist and you're doing a hip thrust, what you're actually doing is you're resisting anterior pelvic tilt first. And like I said off the jump, is like in order to train the glutes, you need to be in a more neutral pelvic position. So, and look, none of these are bad or good. It's just about understanding the right tool for the right job at the right time. So center of mass is a meta principle. So I'm going to leave you with the big rock. I'm going to leave you with like, well, how is it that the applied load or the intersection of my torso and gravity is affecting the position of my center of mass? And is it making it more difficult? I.e. hip thrust, not a bad thing. We're going to need a nice core to help keep that rib cage adjacent to the pelvis so that when we extend our hip, we're doing it in an uncompensated fashion, right? So like if I have 450 pounds across my lap, it's going to pull me into an anterior pelvic tilt, but I could still do a hip thrust. Why? Because I'm not using my glute anymore. I'm using my glute, my adductor magnus, and my hamstring, because the change of the position of the pelvis due to my inability to control the center of mass is going to challenge my ability to keep that neutral pelvis position that I'm going to require to use my glute as the dominant hip extender, right? Whereas if I put a 25-pound plate on my chest and I'm on the 45-degree low back extension, that's going to suggest that I adopt more of a rib cage over pelvis position, which is going to allow me to drive hip extension a little bit greater in that already fully shortened or weakened fully shortened position. So let's go big picture one more time from the top. We're looking at structure function relationships. We got to understand that, these issues aren't necessarily just an issue of bone and ligament. There's plenty of opportunity to improve muscle, right? So improve the ability for muscles to contract, co-contract, or in some cases relax to better our position. Talk about locomotion, gait cycle, stance phase, early stance, mid stance, late stance. There's a lot there. There's a lot to go over. But as far as like, hey, let's just try a key takeaway for today. I'm going to go in the movement. I'm going to move side to side, right? I'm going to do some side bending stuff. Maybe try to stretch out my obliques. Maybe stretch out your lats. Maybe stretch out your glutes. Maybe do some side bends off a bench, like a Copenhagen plank with both your feet on. Let the pelvis drop all the way down. Watch. The side that you hip shift away from will be the side that's super tight, and you're moving towards that path of least resistance, right? So focusing on creating that closed chain internal rotation. And then lastly, understanding how center of mass. Well, how does the direction of the applied load change our position? Position dictates